Nobody is going to ever replace the capacity of a human. And this is why thinking is our number one obsession.
A College of Arts and Sciences education gives you the confidence to bring together all the strands that you value and apply them in ways that are fulfilling for you as an individual, but also resonate out.
You have to really look at schools as a place to grow as yourself. And I think that URI does a great job of that.
There's a sense of pride in the work that you put out there. Students are just excited. Whatever field they're in, they want to be the best at it. And I think that's kind of infectious.
The thing that sets URI apart is that we as a faculty and as an institution ask our students not just what you can do, but who can you be?
Welcome to the annual Fredrika Wild Schweers Lecture on Gender and Health. My name is Katie McIntyre. I'm an assistant professor of Gender and Women's Studies and the associate director of the honors program. The Schweers Lecture was established in 1981 by Dr. Patricia M. Farnes in honor of Freddie Wild Schweers, a very gifted young woman who passed away at the age of 16 after a 13-year battle with leukemia. Sadly, only 4 years later, Patricia Farnes, the pathologist who took care of Freddie, lost her own battle to cancer. This series, done annually, honors the courage and dedication of Fredrika Wild Schweers, Dr. Patricia Farnes, and Fredrika's mother, Jeannie Wild, who has been an advocate of supportive emotional health services for patients and their families at Hasbro Children's Hospital here in Rhode Island. This lecture honors the courage and inspiration of these remarkable women. Tonight, we welcome teacher, activist, advocate, and public intellectual Professor Loretta Ross to discuss the theme, Black Maternity and Reproductive Justice. Tonight, we're going to have a question and answer segment after the talk, so please type any questions you have into chat at any time, and be sure to like and share this talk on social media. Right now, I would like to invite Dr. Jessica Frazier, my colleague, Associate Professor of History and Gender and Women's Studies, to introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Frazier?
Thank you, Professor McIntyre. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, activist and public intellectual, Professor Loretta Ross. Professor Ross cut her activist teeth in the 1970s in Washington, D.C., where she worked for, volunteered at, and led social change organizations. She dedicated her time to a rape crisis center, a tenants' rights group, and an anti-apartheid solidarity project. Since then, her life's work has been devoted to crossing and breaking down false barriers, separating women's rights issues from civil rights issues from human rights issues. Placing the experiences of women of color at the center of social justice conversations, Ross has consistently investigated the interconnections between women's access to healthcare, education, jobs, childcare, housing, and their reproductive rights. She was central in the 1990s to an imagining of what reproductive justice could look like, pointing out that for women of color, they have often had to fight for the right to have children and to parent children in safe and healthy environments, as well as for the right to access safe means to manage their fertility. Under the framework of reproductive justice, she has analyzed the ways in which white supremacy has shaped debates over reproductive rights. Ross has worked at a number of nationally renowned organizations, including the National Organization for Women, the National Black Women's Health Project, the Center for Democratic Renewal, the National Center for Human Rights Education, and SisterSong, the Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective. She was national co-director of the 2004 March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C., and has worked internationally, building coalitions between U.S. women of color and women around the world. Ross has co-written 3 books on reproductive justice and has a forthcoming book, Calling In, the Calling Out Culture, and teaches a course of the same name at Smith College. She has appeared on talk shows and news programs, has been interviewed on a number of podcasts, and has been featured in national newspapers and news magazines. Ross has won dozens of awards for her activism and leadership, and I hope she will forgive me for not naming all of them, but she has most recently been named a top 100 feminist for 2020 by Ms. Magazine. Please join me in welcoming Professor Loretta Ross.
Thank you. That was an excellent and kind introduction. It is an honor to have a chance to speak to you tonight. I am really pleased that I got a chance to speak not only from the comfort of my living room, but about a topic to which I am eternally devoted, which is reproductive justice. I am going to talk about Black maternity and mortality issues through a reproductive justice and human rights lens tonight, but I'm going to add a little bit something special because since co-inventing reproductive justice in 1994, I've been turning my thoughts more towards a concept that I'm calling reproductive futurism. How does the reproductive justice framework look if we can project into the future the development of assisted reproductive technologies and whether or not the framework is sturdy enough, capacious enough to handle these new developments. So I'm going to start by first trying to share my PowerPoint from the beginning. Hopefully you can see that. I'm just going to trust that you can. Anyway, as you've seen, I've been on a lot of talk shows. A lot of people ask me, how do you keep Joe Scarborough in check? Because he has a way of sucking up all the air when you're on screen with him. And I said, well, you just got to talk more than he does. He shouldn't go up against a professional feminist. But anyway, let me move on. I'm also offering training for $5 a lecture on my Calling In book, along with Sonia Renee Taylor. I'm doing one for the African American community that starts April 21st for 4 consecutive Wednesdays. All the lectures are $5 each, and you can get on my website, Loretta J. Ross. And then on June 1st, I'm doing one for the general audience, for anyone who wants to come with no long trend. And that's also for $5 starting June 1st. So I just want to give people a preview of what I'm doing with the Calling In training. And I'm very proud to announce news that has just astonished me because Simon & Schuster has just offered me $1.25 million for my Calling In book. And so I think I'm onto something, trying to teach this new framework for human rights activism in the United States. But first, before I take a deep breath and recover from that news I got less than 24 hours ago, I want to talk about the context in which we're looking at reproductive politics in. I think that it's very predictable that by the middle of this century, that white people are going to become a minority within this country. And of course, there's a lot of frictions attended to that because I would argue that the fear of becoming a minority, even the largest minority within a nation of minorities, is driving many of the attacks on women's reproductive rights, the attacks on birth control, the attacks on abortion, the attacks on evidence-based sex education, actually even the attacks on sexual pleasure. But I would invite you, if you'd like to see a film called Demographic Winter. Try not to pay any money for it because it's being promoted by the right wing, but it's about their population alarmism fears, but not talking about overpopulation, but what they call the underpopulation of Western civilization that is driving their fears. And they made this film in 2008 and distributed to every member of Congress. So we need to connect these dots and understand that really what we're looking at, unlike the time when there was forced breeding of Black women during the enslavement, we're in a period where there's coerced breeding of white women because it suits the needs of people. Again, kind of like 100 years ago with the Comstock laws prohibiting birth control and abortion information from being shared. We're in a similar period right now. And if you don't understand the intersection of race and gender in reproductive politics, you're only missing, you're only accounting for half the problem. I also think we have the problem with climate change because it is predicted that at the same time the demographics shift, that there's going to be 200 million global refugees that are going to be basically pushing at our borders, and we're really going to have to ask if if borders and these nation states are going to be outmoded, because right now they're extremely porous because governments don't have control over information, pandemics, businesses, money, crime, environmental problems, and migration. And I believe that the white supremacists, white nationalists, which I also call the neo-fascists, that are certainly populating the Republican Party now, will actually demand an upgraded form of imperialism as they have these wars to secure and just confiscate natural resources around the world. But they also may try to do an apartheid-like system here in the United States, because it's only under an apartheid system that you can really have a small minority of people trying to control a larger majority, and reinstituting forms of segregations with gated communities and all these other undemocratic policies. And actually, we're looking at the active deconstruction of democracy now, where people are simply saying that if white people can't control it, then they'd rather not have democracy. When you look at the voter suppression and all of that taking place, to basically deny anyone who's not white a right to vote. And this will precipitate a perpetual set of internal wars and external wars as well to justify the securing of these natural resources, because there's going to be a fierce competition for them. And one of the things I believe is that many of the countries of the global south are intentionally underdeveloped so that they cannot protect their own natural resources. And I fear that our scientific and technological developments, to which we gladly provide too much personal and private information, are going to actually enable upgrading of our social and economic inequalities. And that's going to require both our corporations, our governments, and our nonprofit organizations to shift how we think about doing our work, and whether or not we like this granular intrusion into our lives, and what effect will that have on reproductive justice demographics. For example, if you have an app that can monitor your period and that information is not kept private, what impact will that have on people who think that they have a right to control women's fertility? Those kind of questions we need to be asking ourselves. So the concept of reproductive justice was conceptualized by 12 Black women, of which I was one, in 1994. And we created this concept because we didn't like the fact that abortion rights was always isolated from the social justice issues that we felt were dominant in people's lives and really affected how they made their reproductive decisions. And so we spliced together the concept of reproductive rights and social justice to coin the term reproductive justice. And of course, we were not the first ones to think that we needed a more holistic framework. If you look at the picture on the left, it's from the 1970s, when Black women were protesting sterilization abuse and calling it a human rights violation, like we do within the reproductive justice movement. And the bottom left picture is from the Pink Pussy March protesting Trump's inauguration, which of course was again Black women saying, never will we go back to coat hanger abortions. And then in 2010, when these anti-abortion billboards were put around the country, my organization, SisterSong, formed the Trust Black Women Partnership that went from being a partnership, which still exists, by the way, to being a hashtag. So that I don't even know that young lady that's carrying that sign, but that's what happens when you create a framework whose time has come and people pick up on it. And I want to tie this to the Black maternity crisis. Linda Villarosa is a friend of mine, and of course, she did a detailed study of the Black maternity crisis in the New York Times. So I'm quoting quite a bit from her article. She had interviewed me for the article, didn't actually make it into the final print, but that's okay, because she did a masterful job of analyzing how this Black maternity crisis is really being driven by the failure to diagnose and treat pre-existing conditions during pregnancy for Black women, like high blood pressure, preeclampsia, and eclampsia. And there's so many racial biases in medical diagnoses and treatments, and this has been proven in numerous studies, and it really reflects the poor training in medical schools and in other healthcare training schools. And we think that this bespeaks a lack of an intersectional reproductive justice analysis. And particularly, you need to intersect violence with reproductive health. For example, it is estimated that in the African American community, at least 25% of young Black girls do not make it to age 18 without being sexually abused by adult male predators in their lives. There's usually a 10-year age gap between Black teen pregnant mothers and the men in their lives. And so if you don't make that intersectional analysis, you end up blaming the young teenagers for the pregnancies and not looking at the violent conditions under which their lives are being lived. And the United States is only one of 13 countries where our maternal mortality rate is actually worse now than it was 25 years ago. And it's estimated that 700 to 900 maternal deaths occur annually in the United States. And Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from these pregnancy-related causes that are not being diagnosed as their white counterparts, according to the Centers for Disease Control. And they've done a lot of work because there was assumption that the Black maternity crisis was being driven by poverty. But when they did the studies and found out that middle and upper class Black women had the same maternal mortality issues as poor Black women, they figured out that racial stressors, not class, are key predictors of what these poor birth outcomes that we are studying and looking at. And they call this weathering, which is a consequence of repeated exposure to a climate of discrimination and insult. And what even proves this theory even more is that, interestingly, in the white community, younger white women who have babies have worse birth outcomes statistically than older white women who have babies. But in the Black community, those numbers are reversed. The younger Black women have better pregnancy outcomes than the older Black women. And so the theorists believe that it's because of the accumulation of those racial stressors in the older Black women that actually has an impact on these negative and problematic birth outcomes, as well as the maternity crisis. And it's very common to ignore the health concerns voiced by Black women. Of course, you've all heard about the way that the medical establishment didn't even want to listen to Serena Williams when she was complaining about a pulmonary embolism because she'd had one before she knew exactly what the symptoms were. And the doctors poo-pooed her until she just threw a Serena tantrum and made them pay attention. And she could have died from them ignoring her. So it was not her class that got her ignored, it was her race. And so pregnant women who receive support from the doula movement, and the doula movement is reminiscent of the granny midwifery movement that Black women got most of their health care from until the 1960s. People who have the services of doulas actually are 39% less likely to have an unnecessary C-section. And then when mothers who received doula support had half as many preterm births and low birth weight babies as other women from the same African American community. So we've got a lot of drivers of this Black maternity crisis that I wanted to talk about, for which we need to be clear. But we're also dealing with the entire criminalization of Black women's bodies that is driving these stressors. Of course, before the Civil War ended, Black women's fertility was prized because it was profitable for the slave owners, for the plantation owners. But once the Civil War ended in 1865, then it became criticized, criminalized, and really punished. But interestingly enough, W.E.B. Du Bois did a sociological study that he published in 1899 that proved that after the end of the Civil War, Black women voluntarily cut their birth rate in half. And that was before the growth of the birth control movement led by Margaret Sanger. And of course, we experience all these stereotypes of being mammies, Jezebel, sapphires, because basically we have a white supremacist society that's claiming that we're bad mothers when it comes to mothering our own children, but we make excellent mothers when it comes to mothering white children. And we get the punishment of Black reproduction, like Dorothy Roberts writes a lot about, through the child welfare and foster care system, and generally through over policing of the Black community as well. And of course, I can't say that without paying attention to what's happening to the trial for the murder of George Floyd today. And there's a concept that Akile Mbembe has talked about called necropolitics, which talks about the disposability of Black bodies through discrimination, where they decide who can live and who should thrive and who should die and who should suffer. And I want to talk about how even those protections that are supposed to be neutral, that should be available to us, are not available as Black women. For example, when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin in a stand your ground defense that got him acquitted of Trayvon's murder, in Florida, in that same state, a Black woman named Marissa Alexander had an order of protection against her violent husband. And when he came over to attack both her and her newborn baby one day, she grabbed a gun and fired into the air to scare him away. She didn't even hit him. She fired into the air, yet she got convicted for 20 years in jail for attempted murder, even though she used the same stand your ground defense that George Zimmerman had used. And so we see this utter lack of concern about the human rights of Black bodies, whether it's through police brutality or simply the unavailability of what should be neutral laws that are applied in a very racist and discriminatory and sexist way. And one of the tensions within the reproductive health rights and justice movement I'll be talking about later is how certain contraceptives, like long-acting reversible contraceptives we call LARCs and Depo-Provera, which are the injectables, three-month injectables, are being heavily promoted into vulnerable communities like Black women and Latinos and Native Americans. And it's not that these contraceptives are medically problematic in really strong sense. I mean, Depo-Provera, if you use it for 40 years, has been seen to be carcinogenic, but very few people contracept for that long. But the problem is that vulnerable women are not offered a range of contraceptive options so that they can make the decisions for themselves which risks they want to expose themselves to. And they're not given fully informed consent about the LARCs and the Depo-Provera. And so we see this targeting of vulnerable Black women. And of course, we still have the ongoing sterilization abuse, like the woman was protesting in the 1970s. Well, it's still going on in 2020, as a friend of mine, Dawn Wooten, who became a whistleblower nurse at the ICE detention center here in Georgia, when she exposed that immigrant women under the custody of the United States government were being illegally and immorally sterilized. Like if the woman went to the doctor complaining about a headache, she'd leave the doctor with a hysterectomy. If she came that she was had a toe ache, she was leaving with the hysterectomy. And Dawn not only discovered these reproductive abuses that were taking place, but she also found the director of the ICE center shredding documents covering up their human rights violations of these immigrant women. And of course, Black women are also dealing with reproductive punishment through pregnancy policing, and even if they're doing self-managed abortions, they're getting arrested for it if authorities have a reason to believe that they tried to have abortion. Of course, we've had convictions of Asian American women for this as well, and I think some Latino women. And also, we have the adultification of Black children through state and non-state actors, like the police departments across the country. I just read a story about a 5-year-old throwing a tantrum who was handcuffed. In Rochester, New York, there was a 9-year-old girl who was handcuffed and sprayed with tear gas because she was throwing a tantrum. They won't let our children be children and act like children without calling in the heavy hand of the state, I guess, to accustom them to being abused by law enforcement. And we don't even have sufficient legal remedies to address these things. So I'm not surprised there's an allostatic consequence to the criminalization of Black women's bodies that show up in the Black maternity crisis. So a lot of this is being driven by the white genocide paranoia of the formal and the informal white supremacist movement. And when I talk about white supremacy, I need to clarify that I'm talking about an ideology, a body of ideas that I call white supremacy, and that needs to be separated from the identity of whiteness. Whiteness is just an identity, like, being Black or Asian American or any of those things. But it's important to make that separation because not all white supremacists are white, and not all white people are white supremacists. But because we're so accustomed to conflating a white identity with the ideas of white supremacy, it creates a lot of guilt, shame, paralysis, and just bad DEI work, because simply failing to make that distinction really ends up building up this whole thing of white fragility and fear of racial extinction and all kinds of stuff, even among liberals. So I just wanted to point out that we need to make that necessary separation. And then, of course, this fear of racial extinction has really deep roots in the psyche of America. And it's often based on something that most people don't expect, and that's a strong core of anti Semitism, because the people who are paranoid in that particular way believe that Black people and other people of color are being manipulated by Jewish people to attack and eliminate what they call the pure white race. And so they talk about this white genocide as they fear extinction by what they consider genetically inferior people who are not white, because they have this myth of the preservation of a pure white race. And this is accompanied again by misogynistic and sexual tropes. This is a long-standing belief system. Madison Grant in 1916 wrote a book that was read in the White House called The Passing of the Great Race. And of course, even today, our modern academies are re-legitimizing and reintroducing scientific racism. And it begins to affect public policy because these ideas start on the far right that are based on biology, biological deterministic framework, but then they migrate to the religious right, who wrap a moral mantle around it. You see that in the right-wing evangelical Christian movement that's supporting Trump, for example. And by the next time you see these ideas, they're being handled by the Republicans and the conservative movement that claim that they don't use biological issues because they're not racist, and they're not even using religious justifications for these same ideas. They instead claim things like you hear Mitch McConnell saying, the economy just simply can't afford all these people who aren't contributing to our society because we're the makers and they're the takers. So this producerist narrative is a very popular frame of thinking in the conservative movement. Of course, you see it with the Make America Great slogans and the white grievance politics that you see so popular nowadays amongst the conservatives, and their fears that they are being canceled, not only linguistically, but literally. And these ideas, this paranoia is minimized by conservatives who want to appear mainstream, but it's also talking about the long-standing endurance of the ideology of eugenics, the belief that you can socially engineer better human beings. And of course, the people who believe these theories believe that they already got a head start on being better human beings. And then everybody else is supposed to catch up to them, I guess. And so even though they don't use the word eugenics nowadays, you see these eugenical-like policies, Darwinian-like policies, show up in our public policies over and over again. And it's not just biological, because we end up have a long history of nativist immigration and social control policies, formally beginning with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, but even before then, there was the 1875 Page Act that excluded Chinese people from immigrating. And interestingly, when they did the Johnson National Quotas Act, National Origins Act, that set up quotas for who could come to America with severe limits on the Asian and Black populations, they also at the same time passed the country's first federal anti-miscegenation legislation, forbidding people of different races from marrying. And you saw Richard Spencer, the guy who created the term the alt-right in 2013, supporting and promoting the Madison Grant book from 1916 when he was supporting Trump. And in an interesting way, he switched to supporting Biden. That's because Trump ended up not delivering the white revolution that he thought he should. And then we saw again the resurrection of the anti-Semitism when in 2019, Robert Bauer shot up the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And so this white genocidal paranoia is driving a lot of this. And when I talk about eugenics, I'm talking about biological population control methods, like Native American children being removed to boarding schools, being kidnapped from their families, the Christian movement that's trying to kind of like destroy indigenous communities, encouraging Native women to marry white men in some countries, like in New Zealand. There was a whole film about it called Rabbit Proof Fences. Or like we see the more recent Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett doing, cross-racial adoptions so that they can proselytize to these poor orphans from these countries that they have, quote, rescued. And continuing sterilization abuse, that's been a historical practice but visited on Native American, Mexican, Puerto Rican, and African American communities. And of course, we've had historical reproductive oppression of incarcerated people, but it's also taking place today. For example, Human Rights Watch has done a report talking about how these purportedly anti-abortion presidential administrations still force abortions on incarcerated women when they've been impregnated by prison guards because they don't want evidence of the sexual abuse in these prisons to become very visible in the form of a baby. And we still have sterilization abuse, like I talked about. And for the trans community, it is particularly alarming when they have mandatory or forced gender reassignment surgery so that they can be housed with the population that matches their preferred identity instead of being exposed to violence within the population that's opposite their preferred identity. And of course, medical experimentation on Puerto Rican women to develop the birth control has been talked about a lot. And even more recently, the immigration restrictions like the Muslim bans. And when I talked about forced breeding of white women previously, I want to bring into our discussion how the whole white baby thing has been commodified. And I've been to a lot of adoption conferences where young white women are talking about not only were they persuaded to continue pregnancies that at first they didn't want to continue, but then it was seen kind of like as their religious obligation to have these babies. And it's creating to create and feed that market for white babies. And then there's a lot of pressure being put on white women to do egg donations, uh, purportedly so that they could either help somebody else have a baby or store their eggs for the future, even those people who are promising these future children don't tell you that most of the eggs harvested, only 13% of the eggs harvested result in a successful pregnancy. But that doesn't stop them from charging somebody $20,000 to store their eggs. And so we really need to look at the forced breeding of white women that's taking place in a modern way. But there are also non-biological examples of population control. I'm gonna let you read that for yourself, but this is what reproductive justice requires us to do to connect these apparently disparate policies so that we can see how they influence reproductive decision making, like housing availability and affordability, gentrification, in other words, environmental problems, gerrymandering, to so that elected officials select their voters instead of the voters selecting the officials. Uh, we've got a lot of rural towns succeeding from inner cities, for example, police violence, on and on and on. And so a lot of times people don't see these, what looks like non-biological issues, having the impact on reproductive decision making that they actually do. And so, having said all of that, when I was introduced, there was an overview provided of the three core reproductive justice principles that we created in 1994 to address all of these issues that I previously described that we faced. Because were subjected to continuing and enduring strategies of population control as Black women, when we created reproductive justice, we put our first tenet up there as the right to have a child, and we made it a human right to have a child, and that's the right to not only have children, but under the conditions under which we need to have children. So we've given birth to a birth justice movement, which is understanding the importance of midwives and doulas to helping us have more successful birth outcomes and to resist unnecessary cesareans, and of course, to make sure that the birth plans that we have for ourselves are respected. But we also overlap and join with the pro-choice movement. And the term pro-choice, by the way, is a great term. Don't not use it because you think that we Black women are demanding that it be ceased. That's not on us. We created reproductive justice by centering ourselves in the land. It's actually a mistake to think that we created it in opposition to pro-choice as a term, because if that had been our goal, instead of centering ourselves in the lens, we would have centered white women. But we overlap with the pro-choice movement in fighting for the right not to have a child. Like I said, using a birth control or abortion or abstinence if you can hold on. But it's the third tenet of reproductive justice, the human right to parent her children, that brings us into so much conversation with all the things on this page. As I said, the tax policies, the gentrification. Do you have a room to put your baby in? Can you afford to house your child? What about your gun violence? How does your credit scores affect how you're able to buy a car, for example? Or how vulnerable our communities are to eminent domain or lack of social services and what have you. And so it is that third tenet that brings us into most conversation with other social justice movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. I was at SisterSong about 8 years ago, I believe. I just left as the executive director, but I was back there at a meeting between the leaders and the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, meeting with the leaders of the reproductive justice movement. And the reason we had asked for this meeting was because when the BLM, the Black Lives Matter people, had put together their policy platform, somehow they never put anything dealing with reproductive politics into their policy platform, even though the founders of Black Lives Matter were all Black women. And so when we pointed this out to them, they did kind of like a big oops. And what one of them actually said was, I've always been a personal feminist, but now you're showing me that I failed to be a political feminist, and understand that we can't talk about Black Lives Matter without talking about how Black women's bodies matter. And so we use reproductive justice as that framework to build that big tent, to bring in a lot of other issues that people don't normally think about when it comes to reproductive politics. About 10 years after the original framework was created, our QPOC, our Queer People of Color Caucus within SisterSong, started demanding, and we accepted the idea of a fourth reproductive justice principle. And this was because people thought that we were not paying sufficient attention to people who had no intention of having a baby and having, how can I say, offering a less womb-centric analysis. And so in that fourth principle, they said that individuals have the human right to disassociate sex from reproduction, and healthy sexuality and pleasure are essential components to whole and full human life. Most people don't understand that the reproductive justice model is actually three components. It's the reproductive health model that focuses on service delivery. That's where your doctors, your nurses, your hospitals, your abortion clinics, all of those are concentrated. Reproductive rights is synonymous with the pro-choice movement. They're the ones who work within the limits of the US Constitution to advocate for the right to abortion, to birth control, to evidence-based sex education and stuff like that. The reproductive justice framework is an organizing framework where we want to bring, as I said, ourselves into conversations with other social justice movements. And then we, instead of working within the limits of the US Constitution, we work instead using the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that global legal framework, as our foundation. And we learned this from going to many international women in health conferences, and we found that women in the global South were using the human rights framework and achieving so much more, even in limited political spaces, than we were achieving with the privacy framework within the US legal system. And so it's an organizing framework. And so when we talk about it, we talk about reproductive health rights and justice. Now, since we created this framework, we've also, of course, had to articulate how it does oppose all these strategies of population control, because we feel that population control threatens our communities of color by devaluing our community of color and inflating the value of white communities. And it, of course, invokes all these stereotypes, the racist, sexist, transphobic, etc., so that they can justify this inflation and deflation. And of course, population control limits everyone's reproductive freedoms and right to self-determination. And even feminists have gotten into the game of population control using euphemisms like population stabilization or population justice, when in fact those are just, mere euphemisms for the same set of politics. And the reason that I think that's a problem is that a reproductive justice advocate believes that every human being has the right to be self-determining over whether or not they have children or not. Where with the population control wing of our movement, they agree with us in supporting birth control and abortion, but they see that as part of the pathway to getting to somewhere else. So let's provide this birth control to this community to end poverty. Or let's provide birth control to this community to end the risk of terrorism or environmental degradation, or a whole other issues by which they want to utilize women's bodies while not understanding that women have the human right to make the decisions what they do with their bodies and not serve another person's agenda. Anyway, we have this resurrection of eugenics thinking, and through the pseudoscience and the manipulation of all human beings, and we actually get to thinking that this stuff is rational. And so we always have to link these disparate policies together and see how they manipulate targeted populations. And this population control framework actually divides the pro-choice and RJ movement, even though we unite to fight the anti-abortion movement. And by definition, eugenics and population control violates people's human rights. And my co-author, Ricky Solinger, has coined this concept of reproductive individualism. And she talks about how this came up in the late 20th and early 21st century around the framework of neoliberal capitalism, where they're trying to basically promote this concept of individual choice and the use of reproductive technologies, which are often used in a racist way, uh, trying to say basically it's a consumer's choice kind of issue. And what this does is ignore how reproduction is actually tied to demographic, environmental, and political issues. But yet public officials use this reproductive individualism argument like they used in the Hyde Amendment back in the 1970s, 1976 when they passed the bill, and 77 when the Supreme Court upheld it, by basically saying, well, if you're making an individual decision to have an abortion, then the government has no obligation to spend tax money to support your individual decision. And we, of course, have argued against that framework forever because, I mean, human beings make individual decisions all the time. I might make an individual decision to vote, but the government has an obligation to make sure that I can actually exercise that individual decision. I might make an individual decision to catch a plane, but the government has an obligation to make sure that that plane is safe, that the airfare is affordable, and that the airport is accessible. So it's just BS to claim that reproductive individual decisions, we don't need government support, or the government is not obligated to provide support for that decision. And another thing that Ricky's analysis points out too is the dichotomy between describing basically heteronormative white couples as good choice makers and everybody else as bad. And so we've pushed back on this analysis with reproductive justice, but even then, the ideology of reproductive individualism prevails, and particularly as it contours white nationalist, white supremacist sentiments really dictate the conditions of birthing and dying in the US and elsewhere. And we're not surprised to find that there were a large number of anti abortion proponents inside the movement of the January 6th Capitol insurrection. I did a speech on that a couple of weeks ago with Carol Mason. So, if you're going to use the reproductive justice framework, there are some criteria that we ask that you use. Just because reproductive justice was created by Black women, it doesn't only apply to Black women, because you must use the concept of intersectionality as your process for defining what people's vulnerabilities are. But intersectionality is just the process. Human rights is the goal. And you attend to human rights by centering the most vulnerable people in your lens, because if you take care of their needs, everybody else's needs will also be taken care of. You also have to use a transnational framework by linking global issues to local issues, because quite often our privileges in the United States are gained at the expenses of people outside of the United States. And you have to link individuals to these pre-existing structures of inequality to really analyze reproductive politics in our country and also address the implicit racism and biases I talked about earlier that limit people's reproductive self-determination and options. And our goal is to build enough power to end reproductive oppression. And because it's based on the human rights framework, reproductive justice by definition includes everyone. And I've talked a lot about human rights, so let me articulate the categories that we within the RJ, or reproductive justice movement, mean. The first category is civil rights, the right to be treated as an equal to your society, to anyone else in society. There are other civil rights movements other than the African American one. For example, the disability rights movement is a civil rights movement because they have not yet achieved simple equality. The LGBTQ movement is also a civil rights movement, also fighting for simple equality. Political human rights are the human rights that we most associate with the U.S. Bill of Rights, like freedom of speech, the right to vote, but we recently learned that the right to have our votes counted is always going to be contested by the white supremacist movement. Freedom of assembly, which of course is often denied to people in the Black Lives Matter movement who get violently attacked by police, while the Capitol insurrectionists got welcomed by them in many ways. But they did attack the police there. Economic human rights, things like fighting for the $15 an hour minimum wage, workers' rights, the reason we even have weekends and 8-hour work weeks and stuff are because of the union movement that demanded economic human rights when they were writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Social human rights are those human rights that are born out of your human need, things that you need like healthcare, food, shelter, education, welfare, social security, and other support when you aren't able to take care of and provide for yourself. Cultural human rights, I think the women's movement particularly needs to pay particular attention to, because freedom of religion is a human right, but we need to make sure that we articulate a demand that understands that freedom from religion is always also a human right, so that other people's religious beliefs aren't imposed upon our bodies, particularly if we don't even share the religion of the people with those religious beliefs. I keep saying that since Catholic women use birth control and abortion at the same rate as non-Catholic women, why is the Pope in my bedroom? Because I'm not even Catholic. I mean, I want to say, see to your own people first. Environmental human rights, the right to clean air, water, no toxic neighborhoods, no genetically modified food, etc. Developmental human rights are rights demanded by the global South to control their own natural resources and resist the expropriation of these natural resources by the US military and other Western governments. Sexual rights are those rights demanded by the women's movement starting in the 1970s to articulate the right to have or not have children, to marry, determine when you get married, same-sex rights, which includes LGBT and trans rights, the right to birth control and abortion, and the right to sexual pleasure, my favorite one, and the right to determine and define our families. And I don't want to portray the impression that these are all the human rights that are necessary to claim, because I think there's a ninth category of human rights that we need to bring into our discourse, and that's called digital human rights. We are quickly arriving at a moment in our scientific development that if you are not digitally connected, you will not be able to access healthcare, education, banking, and a whole lot of life services that are necessary to live in an advanced economy. And we saw what damage the digital divide did to a lot of vulnerable children and communities because of COVID. And I have fun thinking about the 10th category. Nobody's talking about this for me because I have the scientific mind. I should add that I majored in chemistry and physics, so I'm really a left-brain girl. But I think the 10th category of human rights is going to be the right to space travel, because pretty soon, if we're going the way we're going, climate change is going to ruin this planet, and it shouldn't be just billionaires like Elon Musk that gets an opportunity to leave it. I want to look a little bit more intentionally at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because this is Article 25. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. And this includes food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Forgive the male-centric language of 1948, but it really does say everyone. It doesn't leave anyone out. And then in Article 2, it's really important to focus on, because it goes on to say motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. And when you analyze that Article 2 clause of Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is what it's basically saying is that everyone has the same human rights, but there are particular times in people's lives or particular identities in people's lives where they are particularly vulnerable. In other words, every child has a human right to an education, but it may be that you have to provide books in Braille for a blind child to enjoy the same access to education that sighted children do enjoy. And so that's where your intersectional identity that determines your vulnerabilities matter, because you have to pay attention to those vulnerabilities in order to provide the human rights protections that are appropriate and address those vulnerabilities. When you use the human rights framework, you also bring into the conversation the Convention on Genocide. And I've highlighted in red the last three categories. So by the way, I should just keep A up there as well, because if we had a really just world, ex-President Trump would be in front of the International Criminal Court at The Hague being tried for the crime of genocide by deliberately downplaying the COVID virus, so much so that, as Dr. Birx and others have testified, an additional 400,000 people died simply because he thought that it would suit his financial and political futures to confuse the messaging and literally to deny that the COVID virus pandemic is real. But anyway, back to reproductive politics in particular, when you deliberately inflict on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, that's genocide. When you impose measures intended to prevent births within a community, that's also genocide. And when you forcibly transfer children of the group to another group, like those caged children that we have in our borders, on the southern border, that's also genocide. And I coined this term called reprocide when you're talking about controlling reproduction through genetics. And since I'm running out of time, I won't read all of those columns, but if you look at the past, it's all of those methods that are married to the present, the methods of the present. And then, of course, as I said, I'm looking at techno-eugenics in my more recent work, how we have all the past methods plus the new assisted reproduction technological methods today, because there's really a question of whether or not these people who are using ART are overpromising their ability to not only deselect people birth defects and traits from children, but also overpromise that they can deliver designer babies. And somehow I don't think that the designer babies that they're going to be planning are going to represent Black children or other vulnerable communities. And so in closing, reproductive futurism, as I'm talking about, is the Black feminist theory of reproductive science and technology that prioritizes Black women's reproductive experiences. Again, that lens that we use to examine techno-utopianism, this overpromise by the scientific community that's operating in a very amoral way, and to resist the techno-eugenics that, of course, will promise us an upgrade of social inequalities. And so I'm just going to put up here some key questions we need to look at, though I won't go through them in any detail, but I think you can read them for yourself. One of the things that I question a lot through reproductive futurism is that, are we worshiping on the altar of the genetic replication of ourselves, and is that good for our future? Because that reinscribes the biological determinist framework, biology is destiny kind of thing that the white supremacist movement believes in. And secondly, is there a human right to a child, and what does it mean? Do we have the human right to exploit others for our need to parent and replicate our DNA? And it really asks the question is, what's so special about our DNA? And so the Haley Women's Center in 2001 offers this warning. The final goal of reproductive engineering appears to be the manufacture of a human being to suit its exact specifications of physical attributes, class, caste, color, and sex. Who will decide these specifications? We have already seen how sex determination has resulted in the elimination of female fetuses. The powerless in any society will get more disempowered with the growth of such reproductive technologies. So to achieve reproductive justice, it occurs when women, girls, and individuals have the economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our labors, sexuality and reproduction for ourselves, our families, and our communities in all areas of our life. I'll close by saying I believe that Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan writer, was right. History never really says goodbye. History always says, see you later. And thank you. Let me stop the sharing for the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Loretta Ross. That was an excellent lecture. You've given us so much to think about. In fact, I already see there's 7 student questions here. So we have a lot of questions to get through. You give us so much good material to think about. And I do want to remind, if you didn't get the chance to ask a question, you can type in a question on chat on YouTube or Facebook, and we look forward to hearing from our audience members. All right, we have, it looks like there's 2 student video questions that have similar themes. So I'm going to play the 2 different video questions, and then maybe you can just answer the 2 questions all at once after we play the 2.
Hi, my name is Rosalind Cajigas. I'm a double major in criminology and criminal justice and gender and women's studies, and I'm part of the class of 2021. When we talk about Black maternity, how has the pandemic negatively affected the progress that has been made? And also, how can we young students contribute to making sure that there is no more negative impact during these times?
Hi, my name is Fredrika Anzaro. I'm a gender studies and statistics major and minor. And I'm taking Jody Lisberger's 320 GWS class. So the question I have for you is, what is the most dramatic or important action that we can take on Black maternal mortality? And what do you think that would look like?
Well, I think the most important and dramatic action we can take on Black maternal mortality is to attack and deconstruct the ideas of white supremacy, because they guide public health policies, they guide the COVID response, they guided the allocation of resources, who gets even prioritized for getting the vaccines. And I do want to admit that the Biden administration is doing probably the best job that it can do. I just got my first vaccine today because they've opened up so many sites in the Black community, because the governor of Georgia likes to put vaccine sites in the Black community like he likes to put ballot voting precincts in the Black community. So it took the federal government to step in to give us access to even a vaccine in an appropriate way in the Black community. And so understand that we're in a battle with the ideas of white supremacy against the ideas of human rights. And you can work on any number of those issues like I had in my slides and really be part of the human rights movement. I'm obviously part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, but you could be part of the indigenous rights wing or the immigrant rights wing or the racial or climate justice wing, all of the human rights movement. And so we have to provide these sturdy analyses that bring together all of these issues and explain them in an accessible way to people so that they understand, first of all, what their human rights are, how they get violated, and what they need to do to protect their human rights, and make that very clear and very plain to people. So that's how I bucket both of your questions, so that we come up with, first of all, what ideas do we need to share that will determine what is the work that we need to do.
Great, thank you. All right, 2 more video questions coming up from students.
My name is Mia Giglietti. I'm a double major in political science and economics, and I'm a sophomore. And my question is, could there be programs or classes required to complete medical school that teach diversity and the specific problems and discrimination that people of color, specifically Black women, experience in healthcare? And if these were implemented, would they be a good solution in combating discrimination in healthcare?
Hello, Professor Ross. My name is Samantha Murphy. I'm a junior here at the University of Rhode Island studying economics with a minor in music. So in your article, you state that the concept of reproductive justice was created because you and your colleagues believed that true healthcare for women needed to include a full range of reproductive health services. Now, it is of my understanding that medicine is often only developed for and tested on men, even at the cellular level. So my question for you is, how should women advocate to have more medicine developed that may help them before, during, and after pregnancy?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. There is a wonderful organization in Washington, D.C. called the National Women's Health Network. I used to serve on the board of that organization some 30 years ago, but they're still going strong. And they're the group that the nonprofit group that advocates for women's health in terms of the drugs and the devices that are designed for women to use, often that aren't tested on women. And so that's where you would do that level of advocacy and scientific work. And they're always looking for people to do terms on the board. So I would recommend that you contact the National Women's Health Network if you want to engage in the conversation about drug and device testing and approval to make sure that women are included in the clinical trials and they're not creating new drugs for conditions women don't have and things like that, because wherever the pharmaceuticals think they'll make a profit, like feminine deodorant projects and stuff like that, they will try to make a profit when there's nothing wrong with how the vagina smells, unless you got a problem. And if you got a problem, you don't need to go by FDS, you need to go to the doctor. But anyway, moving right along, in terms of medical school training, I've been invited by a couple of medical schools to bring human rights and reproductive justice frameworks to their training curricula, but I find that they don't like very much what I say. And I'm suspect that the reason they don't like very much what I say is that I go too far upstream on them. I think that we unnecessarily treat medical training in America as if it should be a hazing process, like you're joining a fraternity. People are being trained by working inhuman hours. They're being brutalized during the training, actually having their human rights violated in the training. And I'm pointing out that that is the precise way you create human rights violators. You first violate their human rights. And so all of this work around cultural competency and getting rid of implicit or explicit racial biases and stuff won't really work when you're actually demanding people that you have brutalized during the training to suddenly recloak themselves in a human rights compassionate system, when in fact you're putting them in hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. You brutalize them during the training, and suddenly they're supposed to have this compassionate, patient-centered care mantle. And our whole system is unnecessarily harsh, because if you compare it to what happens in Europe and other developed countries that prepare their medical professionals, they generally don't use such a harsh model that really just ends up in creating an elite caste of providers without actually providing substantively better health care. And so if you're going to talk about reproductive justice, you're again going to use an intersectional analysis, but also center the needs of the people getting trained in healthcare delivery so that they are not having their compassion trained out of them when it comes time to serving the public.
Excellent. All right, now we have a question. It looks like another student video question. Just one here.
Hi, Dr. Ross. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jenna, and I'm on track to graduate next year with a major in gender and women's studies. And my question tonight is, how can we unify the trans movement and the movement for reproductive justice?
Well, one of the things that I like is that when you use the human rights framework, you can actually focus on different things, but you have to do your work within your focus in a way that doesn't create human rights contradictions for other wings of your same movement. So you can't do work against racism in a homophobic or transphobic way, but you also can't do work for trans rights in a misogynistic way. You can't do work for economic justice in a xenophobic way. And so when you use an intersectional analysis that understands that we are part of the same movement, it's very necessary and relatively obvious that you have to bring together the trans rights movement and the reproductive justice movement. Now, I do have one particular thing that I think needs to be done. And I'm not so sure we should be not admitting that we need more trans service providers to serve the trans community. I mean, we can do all that we want to contour, our abortion clinics and our healthcare centers, and elasticize the definition of women however you want to, and it's necessary to do, because of course trans women are women. But at the same time, if there are not service providers who share the identities of the people being served, I always think that there's going to be something missing. And so I would like to see a greater emphasis on developing trans providers to broaden the field of who's able to provide services, rather than the pressure on putting a whole lot of pressure on cis people to approximate the services that trans people need, instead of creating the space for more trans service providers to be developed.
All right. Next, we have a written question.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Sock, and I am a second-year master's candidate in the International Relations program at the University of Rhode Island. I would first like to thank you for the work that you do that addresses women's issues and human rights. My question for you today is related to reproductive rights and justice. In many states in the U.S., having a miscarriage is illegal, and many women have been imprisoned for this. In other countries, such as El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic, women can be jailed for having an abortion. How can feminist movements, societies, and governments as a whole move forward to eradicate reproductive oppression? Additionally, what can international organizations do to help?
Well, I've been to 60 or 70 countries as part of my 50-year career in the women's movement. And almost inevitably, every time I go to these other countries in solidarity to understand their situation and to better understand my own, those women almost always say, if you're an American, you need to go back home and work on getting America's foot off of our neck, because it is often our international development problems, policies that create problems for them through structural adjustment policies applied to the global South. We have these covert wars that we are perpetuating in these countries, low intensity conflicts they're often called, so that we can secure their natural resources for our corporations, and they follow the lead. And so if they think that the U.S. government wants a strong anti-abortion signal sent, then this is what they do domestically. And so rather than taking our missionary selves over to these other countries and think we're going to save women, we really need to save the soul of our own country and get our foot, like I said, off of their necks. And that's what I've heard in 60 or 70 different countries that I've been to, working with feminists from those countries. And they're very clear that they don't need political tourists. They need people to be anti-imperialist right here in the United States.
All right, we have time for one final question. And it looks like a chat question from Harley Jones. Do you agree with this? If so, how do you keep your emotions in check when dealing with human rights issues that are so intrinsically personal so that you don't get in your own way of your advocacy?
That's a good question. I've had to deal with that all of my life because I'm a multiple rape survivor and an incest survivor. I had no choice in the 1960s to have a baby through incest, and because I chose to keep him, I ended up basically co-parenting with my rapist, which is not an ideal way to become a mother. And so I've had to intentionally work on my embedded trauma, because the first time I was raped, I was 11 years old, kidnapped from a Girl Scout outing. And so at first, when I got into the movement, I wasn't attending to my trauma. I thought I could just ignore it and just do good work and I would be okay. And I found out that without intentionally getting some therapy and dealing with my healing, that I was bringing all my trauma to the movement and really compromising my effectiveness. And so I really believe in getting self-care, particularly around issues going on in your head, Because we're all, I mean, it's traumatized people that are drawn to this work. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're traumatized, but we should be strategic around how we handle the trauma that is inevitably in the people that are drawn to human rights work, so that we can actually stay more focused on the people who are committing the human rights violations and not calling each other out, which is why I wrote my last book on calling in the calling out culture, because I'm not writing it about the right, I'm writing it about the left and how we are a circular firing squad, thinking that the way that we should do social justice activism is to weaponize our trauma against each other. And that is not a winning strategy, and it's not a survivable one.
All right, that includes our talk tonight. Thank you so much, Professor Loretta Ross. That was an amazing lecture. I can tell from the student chat, there's so many students just really complimenting your lecture, and I wish we had more time, but we will bring Professor Loretta Ross back again soon, I hope. Thank you to the audience. Thanks for being so engaged. Thank you again to the Department of Gender and Women's Studies for sponsoring the 2021 Fredrika Wild Schweers lecture. Good night, everybody.